In November 1950, Marine Private Joe R. Baldonado stood watch in North Korea, his M1 Garand frozen solid in his hands. 30 degrees below zero, he saw a dark river moving on the distant ridge. Not snow, a tide of silent, quilted uniforms pouring over the crest. An entire army unseen. How does a massive army vanish into thin air? How were 30,000 elite troops completely surrounded? The official explanation is a lie. The terrifying truth reveals a deeper betrayal no one has explained. What does it say about the people you trust when they tell you everything is fine? To understand what happens next, you need to picture the world in the autumn of 1950, not as a black and white photograph, but as a raw, uncertain present. The Second World War has been over for only 5 years, and its ghosts still walk the earth. A new kind of conflict, a Cold War, is freezing international relations, and Korea is its first real fire. The United Nations forces, led by the United States and commanded by the legendary General Douglas MacArthur, have just executed a stunning reversal of fortune. After being pushed to the brink of defeat at the Pusan perimeter, MacArthur's brilliant amphibious landing at Inchon shattered the North Korean army. By October, UN troops had crossed the 38th parallel, captured the northern capital of Pyongyang, and were now racing toward the Yalu River, the border between Korea and the newly formed People's Republic of China. The mood at MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo was not just confident, it was triumphant. The war was considered all but won. MacArthur himself had publicly promised the troops they would be home by Christmas. He dismissed warnings from China that they would intervene if UN forces approached their border, calling it diplomatic blackmail. To you, looking at a map, this advance seems logical, the final push of a victorious army. But on the ground, the reality was dangerously different. The American X-Corps, which included the 1st Marine Division, was advancing deep into the Taebaek Mountains, a brutal landscape of steep ridges and narrow, winding dirt roads. They were not moving as a unified front, but as separate, isolated columns, with huge, unsecurable gaps between them. Their supply lines were stretched thin over hundreds of miles of hostile territory. They were advancing, but they also walking deeper and deeper into a trap they could not see, assured by their leaders that no significant enemy forces existed ahead. And the reason nobody stopped them is stranger than anything that came before. And this is where the story stops making sense. The dread did not arrive with a sudden thunderclap. It seeped in slowly, like the relentless, killing cold. In early November, weeks before the main assault, Marine patrols began to run into scattered resistance. They captured the first Chinese prisoners, soldiers of the People's Volunteer Army, or PVA. These men were interrogated, and they told their captors the truth, that entire divisions of the PVA were already inside North Korea, hiding in the mountains, waiting. When these reports reached MacArthur's intelligence chief, Major General Charles Willoughby, they were systematically downplayed, dismissed, or outright ignored. Willoughby's office, operating out of the Daiichi Seimei building in Tokyo, insisted these were only a few thousand symbolic volunteers, not a real army. The evidence that contradicted this narrative was buried. Meanwhile, on the ground, the men of the 1st Marine Division felt the change. The temperature began its terrifying descent, plunging to 20, then 30, then nearly 40 degrees below zero at night. If you had been there, you would have seen engine blocks crack, morphine syrettes freeze solid inside a medic's pack, and sea rations become so hard they had to be thawed over fires, which were forbidden at night for fear of giving away positions. You would have seen men struggling to dig foxholes in ground that was as hard as concrete. Frostbite became a more immediate enemy than the North Koreans. Weapons began to fail. The oil on bolts and moving parts congealed into thick sludge, jamming M1 rifles and Browning automatic rifles. Men urinated on their machine guns to thaw them out. But there was one detail buried in the record that nobody flagged at the time. Night after night, the Marines started hearing strange, unnerving sounds echoing through the valleys. The high-pitched blare of bugles, the sound of whistles and horns. They were told it was just a tactic to spook them, a form of psychological warfare from a scattered, defeated enemy. But it was not. It was communication. The PVA, lacking widespread radio technology, were using these primitive instruments to coordinate troop movements in the dark, maneuvering entire armies into position right under the noses of the UN forces. Major General Oliver P. Smith, the commander of the 1st Marine Division, grew deeply uneasy. He distrusted the intelligence from Tokyo and deliberately slowed his division's advance, ordering his men to build up supply dumps and create a defensible perimeter at every stop. This cautiousness, which infuriated his superiors, would be the only thing that saved them. He was ordered to push his men further north, to spread them out along a single treacherous 50-mile road that ran from the port of Hungnam up to the Chosin Reservoir. You can feel the tension in the cables sent between the front line and the rear echelon. Smith was asking for caution. MacArthur's headquarters was demanding speed. What nobody realized yet, not even the people involved, was that this had already been decided. On November 24th, MacArthur flew to the front to watch the launch of his final offensive. He told reporters the war would be over in 2 weeks. He had no idea he was standing on the edge of a precipice. 3 nights later, on November 27th, the bugles sounded again, not from one direction, but from all of them. The worst part hadn't happened yet. And the reason nobody stopped it is stranger than anything that came before. Here's where it gets worse. Think about the person you trust most in the world to keep you safe. Now imagine the moment you realize they have, through arrogance or incompetence, led you directly into an ambush from which you will likely not escape. That is the feeling that ripped through the 1st Marine Division on the night of November 27th, 1950. For a private shivering in a foxhole near Udamni, on the western side of the reservoir, the war was supposed to be a mopping-up operation. He was thinking about Christmas, about a warm bed, about going home. Then, the world exploded. Flares lit up the sky, revealing not a small patrol, but a solid wall of humanity charging down the hillsides, their padded cotton uniforms making them almost invisible against the snow until they were nearly on top of the American positions. The sound was a deafening roar of bugles, whistles, and human voices, a living wave of soldiers who seemed to ignore machine gun fire, climbing over their own dead to reach the Marine lines. This was not a remnant force. This was a fresh, massive, and determined army. The betrayal felt by those men was not just tactical, it was profoundly personal. They had been promised a swift victory by leaders who were safe in warm offices hundreds of miles away. They had been assured the enemy was broken and fleeing. Now, in the frozen dark, they understood the truth. They had been fed a lie. Their commanders hadn't just been wrong. They had been so profoundly, fundamentally wrong that every order they had followed for the last month had served only to tighten the enemy's noose around their necks. They were not an army on the attack, they were bait. In that moment of terrifying clarity, watching friends die beside them, they knew they had been utterly and completely abandoned. What they found when they finally opened the door changed everything, and not in the way anyone expected. But there's a detail buried in the record that nobody flagged at the time. The initial chaotic hours of the assault felt like a random, overwhelming force of nature, a blizzard of violence. But as the sun rose on November 28th, the true, horrifying shape of the situation became clear. And here's what should make you deeply uncomfortable. This wasn't chaos at all. It was a plan, executed with chilling precision. The Chinese attacks had not been a single frontal assault. They had struck simultaneously at multiple, carefully chosen points along the 78-mile-long supply route that was the Marines' only lifeline. They hit the forces at Udam-ni and the Hagaru-ri perimeter, but they also struck the army units of Task Force McLean Faith east of the reservoir, and, most critically, they seized the high ground overlooking the Funchilin Pass, a narrow choke point on the road south. You need to see this not as a battle line, but as a surgeon's incision. The PVA's 9th Army Group, under General Song Shilun, had not come to fight the Marines head-on. They had come to dissect them. Each attack was designed to isolate one unit from the next, to cut the tendons and arteries connecting the division, and then to annihilate each piece in isolation. The road was no longer a path to retreat. It was a killing jar. The bugle calls were not random noise. They were the conductor's baton, directing a symphony of destruction across 100 square miles of frozen hell. This was not an enemy blundering into them in the dark. This was an enemy that knew exactly where they were going, and had prepared the ground to slaughter them. The realization that they were not just fighting, but were subjects in a vast, premeditated military experiment was a cold dread that settled deep in the bones of every survivor. But none of that prepared anyone for the specific intelligence reports that came out after the fact, revealing the full extent of the betrayal. What you now understand, and what most people never will, is that this wasn't an intelligence failure. It was an intelligence rejection. The Central Intelligence Agency, in a report filed on October 12, 1950, more than a month before the ambush, had explicitly warned the Truman administration that China had both the capability and the intention to intervene in Korea with massive force if UN troops crossed the 38th parallel. They predicted troop numbers in the hundreds of thousands. The British government had passed along similar warnings from their own intelligence sources in Hong Kong. India's ambassador to China, K.M. Panikkar, had personally delivered a direct message from Zhou Enlai. If American troops approached the Yalu, China would enter the war. All of this information flowed to one place, General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters, and it was all disregarded. This wasn't about a lack of information. It was about the supreme, unshakable arrogance of a single commander and the institutional cowardice of the system built around him. MacArthur was a titan, a living legend who had won the Pacific War. His ego was so immense that it created its own gravity, bending all information to fit his preconceived narrative, that China was a broken, backward nation that would never dare to challenge the might of the United States. His intelligence chief, Willoughby, was a sycophant whose primary job was not to find the truth, but to find facts that confirmed the general's genius. Dissenting reports were buried. Contradictory evidence was labeled enemy propaganda. The system wasn't broken. It was functioning perfectly to protect the worldview of the man at the top. The real horror of the Chosin Reservoir is not the overwhelming number of Chinese soldiers. It is the chillingly familiar pattern of how power insulates itself from reality. This is not a uniquely military problem. You have seen this exact dynamic play out in your own world. It is the story of the corporate CEO who ignores market data and drives a company into bankruptcy because he cannot admit his strategy is wrong. It is the politician who dismisses scientific consensus because it is politically inconvenient. What they did not know yet was the reason. The tragedy of the frozen Chosin was not sealed in the Korean snow. It was sealed in a Tokyo office by men who chose to believe a comfortable fiction rather than confront a terrifying fact. And they signed that decision with the blood of thousands of men who had placed their lives in their hands. The answer to the question you've been sitting with this entire video is this. 30,000 men were surrounded by an army 4 times their size because one man's ego was more important than their lives. The system designed to inform him was instead engineered to flatter him. The warnings were not missed, they were discarded. The truth was not hidden, it was declared to be a lie. And the men on the ground paid the price for that arrogance in a currency of frozen limbs and violent death. The Chinese plan was brilliant in its execution, but its success depended entirely on the certainty that MacArthur could not, believe it was possible. They were not betting on tactics or weapons. They were betting on human hubris, and it was the surest bet they could have made. This implicates you because the illusion of informed leadership is one of the pillars of modern society. You are told every day to trust the experts, to believe the official reports, to have faith in the institutions that govern your life and your security. But the story of Chosin is a permanent frozen reminder that these institutions are made of people, and people are fallible. They are susceptible to pride, to ambition, to the simple human desire to hear only good news. The most terrifying secret of the Chosin Reservoir is not that the American military was caught by surprise. It is that it chose to be. Look again at that Marine on watch, standing in the soul-crushing cold. See the moment his eyes register the impossible river of men pouring over the ridge. That moment of realization that everything he was told was wrong, that he is not safe, that he has been sacrificed, is the heart of this story. The next time you listen to a leader declare a mission accomplished, or promise an easy victory, or dismiss a clear warning as fear-mongering, remember the sound of those bugles in the Korean mountains? Remember that the distance between a confident press conference and a frozen battlefield is measured in the lives of those who have no choice but to follow orders. The system that led to Chosin was not dismantled. Its components, arrogance, institutional inertia, the suppression of inconvenient truths, are not historical artifacts. They are active elements in the world you live in right now. Tell me in the comments, which part of this stayed with you?